Shalom and welcome to Neshamacast, exploring Jewish spiritual care today, brought to you by Neshama, Association of Jewish Chaplains. I'm your host, Rabbi Ed Bernstein. Happy Secular New Year to our Neshamacast listeners as we are recording on January 5th, 2026. Neshamacast strives both to engage our professional chaplain colleagues on developments in Jewish spiritual care, as well as inform and educate the broader community on the important role of Jewish spiritual care in the rhythms of our world. Healthcare settings, such as hospitals, often deal with hard cases, and they regularly turn to their in-house ethics committees to process these hard cases, to decide on appropriate next steps from an ethical perspective. Since the healthcare system affects everybody, we want to offer this discussion as a window to the contribution of Jewish chaplains to the field of clinical ethics. Board-certified chaplains are required to demonstrate competency in ethics in their training and certification process, and chaplains often participate in deliberations of ethics panels. At the same time, becoming a board-certified chaplain does not automatically mean that chaplains are experts in clinical ethics. In fact, many chaplains are being tapped to do the formal work of clinical ethics without proper training. There are many other facets of the relationship between these two disciplines, and we have a distinguished panel who will unpack for us the relationship between chaplaincy and clinical ethics. They will discuss the overlap between these fields and also discuss important differences. They will explore gaps in learning and experiences that need to be met in order for chaplains to take leadership roles, and they will discuss why this matters to all of us. So let me introduce our panelists. Chaplain Karen Lieberman serves as the Jewish Chaplain for the Midwest region of Advocate Health. She is board-certified by NAJC and has worked in adult and pediatric hospital settings for over 15 years. Previously, Karen practiced law in both the public and private sectors and served as an adjunct law school faculty member at Marquette University. She has a special interest in the intersection of law, medicine, ethics, and spirituality. She is a co-author of a recent article, The Expanding Role of United States Healthcare Chaplains in Clinical Ethics, that was published in the Journal of Religion and Health. Karen lives in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Rabbi Dr. Jason Weiner, board-certified chaplain, is the senior rabbi and executive director of the Spiritual Care Department at Cedars-Sinai in Los Angeles, where he oversees the chaplaincy team and all spiritual care services across the health system. He also serves as rabbi of Knesset Israel Synagogue of Beverlywood. Rabbi Weiner serves on the executive committee of the Cedars-Sinai Bioethics Committee and chairs the ethics committee of NAJC. Rabbi Weiner lectures and writes on Jewish medical ethics, and several of his acclaimed works are cited in the show notes. This is Rabbi Weiner's second appearance on Neshamacast, and I invite listeners to check the Neshamacast feed for his prior conversation last year with me and Rabbi Shira Stern on the LA fires that happened as we record exactly 1 year ago. Rounding out our panel is Rabbi Dr. Neal Loevinger. He serves as Director of Spiritual Care and Chaplaincy and as the Ethics Coordinator at Vassar Brothers Medical Center in Poughkeepsie, New York. He is a certified healthcare ethics consultant and is working on a master's in bioethics at Einstein College of Medicine. Rabbi Loevinger also serves as the rabbi of Congregation Temple Beth El in Coneonga Lake, New York, the heart of the Borscht Belt. Rabbi Loevinger has previously served on the board of NAJC, and I have had the honor of serving alongside him there. I'm now going to pass the baton to Rabbi Loevinger, who will facilitate the discussion. Neal, take it away.
Thank you, Ed. It's an honor to be here with two very intelligent and very experienced colleagues. One of the suggestions we had is to talk about the different ways we found ourselves practicing clinical ethics within our institutions, and I think that will illustrate some of the themes in the article, Karen, that you co-authored, which is that chaplains find their way into ethics along various paths and for various reasons. Jason, you want to go first?
Sure. Thank you. It's great to be here with all of you, people who I look up to so much and enjoy our collegiality. For me, ethics, first of all, it's just an interest. It's something that I find fascinating. And in fact, one of the issues we talk about as chaplains is burnout and how to avoid burnout. And for me, having an area in the hospital and the environment that I work in that I find exciting and interesting is always helps to avoid burnout. It's just great. Always, it's interesting. It's always changing. There's so much that's exciting about it. And I find that also being a chaplain, we want to help people. We become chaplains because we want to help. And there's a lot of different ways that we can help people in hospitals, and through ethics work is one of the great way to help people. Also for me initially, to be totally vulnerable and honest, to start our discussion, hopefully you will be as well. When I first began in chaplaincy and when I first became manager of our department, I was in my early 30s. I was a little bit insecure and young and looking for my own niche, and working in a hospital, especially an academic medical center, everyone has PhDs and advanced degrees. And it was a little bit like, what do I provide as a rabbi, as a chaplain? I was insecure about that. I've come to learn much more over the years that we actually do have quite a bit to offer. But I thought, maybe if I got an extra degrees and a doctorate and then became more proficient in a specialty, that would help me to gain more confidence. And truth is, it has helped me to feel like I have a specific expertise that I can offer. So for me, it's been a great aspect of my chaplaincy has been the ethics work.
Karen, how did you get into clinical ethics work? Tell us about your chaplaincy and ethics journey.
Sure. Well, that's a really interesting story, Jason. Thanks for sharing that. I actually started working in ethics before I became a chaplain. So as Ed said, in a previous life, I was a lawyer. And I was asked by the person who was then the director of the bioethics center at the Medical College of Wisconsin, who is also a lawyer, to participate in teaching a course in clinical ethics for first-year medical students. And that was probably about 35 years ago when I did that. And I was there in large part to help students distinguish between legal issues and ethical issues, and to gain clarity about how law may or may not be relevant to the resolution of clinical ethical dilemmas. And I just found the field fascinating, and I continue to participate in the activities of the Bioethics Center. I was teaching and writing about various topics in bioethics and clinical ethics, though at that time, my perspective was channeled mostly through my lawyer's brain, right? And then, I'd say about 20 years ago, still before I was a chaplain, I was asked to join the ethics committee at one of the local hospitals in my area. They were looking to add someone to the committee who was, first of all, a member of the community, but not a hospital staff member. Second, a lawyer. And lastly, someone who was Jewish, because the hospital had a sizable Jewish population and they wanted that voice at the table. And so I met all of those criteria and I joined that committee, which at that time was supported by an exceptionally talented clinical ethicist. And again, I just found the meetings and the work to be so interesting, so fascinating, and I was totally hooked. So that's how I got involved, and I've been involved in the work of clinical ethics in a variety of ways ever since then. Eventually, I transitioned to a second career in chaplaincy, and I was hired by that same hospital to serve as a hospital chaplain. And I continued then, not as a community member, but as a staff member to serve on that ethics committee of that hospital. Over time, I've also served on the ethics committees of a number of other hospitals in my area. I also completed a master's degree in bioethics and health policy, which specifically included coursework in clinical ethics, some of my favorite coursework in that degree. Then when I started working with my current employer almost 5 years ago, the physician who was then the chief medical officer of the hospital where I primarily work asked if I would co-chair that hospital's ethics committee. And so I've just completed my term as the co-chair of that committee, but I continue to participate as a member.
Karen, I think that your story illustrates something we can come back to later, which is that ethics committees, which we should point out are not the only way that clinical ethics happens, especially in bigger hospitals, often want community representation. They also specifically want clergy representation. Sometimes that overlaps with a chaplain's role, sometimes it doesn't. And that distinction between chaplains as clergy and chaplains who can support clinical ethics in more specialized ways is one we can return to. When I took the position here at Vassar Brothers, 11 years ago, on my very first day on the job, I'm unpacking my books and trying to figure out where the bathroom is and the coffee and all of that. And these guys show up in my office and say, we want to tell you that, we need you to be part of the IRB. Like, what's an IRB? I have no idea what an IRB is. Well, the chaplain has always been on the IRB.
Just for our listeners, IRB means Institutional Review Board.
Okay, I'll be on the IRB. And then a little while later, I was told, the chaplain is always on the ethics committee. Okay, what's an ethics committee? I guess I'll be on the ethics committee. And I really didn't know what I was getting into in either of those situations. But I said yes because I figured early on in my tenure here, I should say pretty much yes to everything. And, along the lines of what you said, Jason, prove myself useful and willing and eager and learn in the context of the hospital. And both of those were absolutely wonderful and fascinating experiences. On the IRB, they specifically wanted someone who was not a doctor or a scientist. Everybody else on the IRB, with the exception of one community member, was a doctor or a scientist. We have several colleges near Vassar Brothers here in Poughkeepsie, so they were often professors of one kind of science or another. But they wanted someone on the IRB who represented kind of a holistic or humanistic worldview. And that was really gratifying. It just absolutely helped me understand better what's going on in healthcare and in the hospital on a whole number of levels. And then in terms of the ethics committee, I attended meetings and sort of offered my perspective when I could, but I didn't really understand what the whole thing was about until one day the chief medical officer at that time, who's now the president of a nearby hospital, came in and said, the executive committee was talking about the ethics committee, and we thought you'd be a good person to take it on as the coordinator. The coordinator of the ethics committee here is someone who does the initial intake, chooses a small team or assembles a small team from a much larger, deeper bench of our bigger ethics committee that meets quarterly, and then reviews the case with family, patients, clinicians, and offers recommendations. And I was like, oh, okay, sure, I'll do that. Why not? That sounds interesting. But I quickly realized I needed to give myself a crash course in what clinical ethics was all about. I read all kinds of books and listened to podcasts and read articles and did research on the internet. But I think it wasn't until into the COVID pandemic when the physician co-chair, who was a retired physician, really couldn't come into the hospital. And I said to the administration, I need a physician co-chair who is in the hospital, who can read charts and who can work on this with me. That I got paired up with a physician who actually was working on his doctorate in clinical ethics. And he was a mentor to me and helped me understand that clinical ethics is not just a set of ideas, but it's a practice in the same way that chaplaincy is a practice. And I use the word practice in the same way that, for example, the virtue ethicists would use it, specifically Alistair McIntyre. A practice is a complex, socially coordinated activity that has its own internal goods, its own virtues. And when you demonstrate excellence within that practice, you're doing something good for the community. So, but another way to think of it as a practice is something that has its own internal rules and culture and understanding, and there are specific ways to get better at it and to move the whole practice along. And I think it wasn't until I had a mentor, and even more so until I started studying with the folks down at Montefiore Einstein, that I really deeply understood that clinical ethics is really not about what you think is right, but there's a practice of becoming a better evaluator and analyst of ethical situations that never ends and is always one that can be deeper. So I think I want to shift with that to pick your brains, Karen and Jason. If you had to define clinical ethics and differentiate it, say, from research ethics or organizational ethics, how would you do so, or how do you think your organization does so?
Karen, why don't you go first this time?
Sure. So I think this is really important for us to try to clarify from the outset, because it is easy to confuse. We're talking about something very specific here. When we speak about clinical ethics, we're talking about a specific discipline that exists within healthcare that addresses practical ethical concerns that arise in the clinical care of individual patients. So it focuses on direct patient care, and it provides guidance that is very specific to the particular person or persons, place, time, and context that give rise to the ethical question or issue. And the goal of clinical ethics is to ensure respect for the patient's values and priorities in the delivery of healthcare, while also adhering to professional standards. So in our research article, we distinguish clinical ethics from bioethics. Bioethics is a much more theoretical, academic exercise, and clinical ethics is a very practical, applied discipline. So in bioethics, we might ask, is it ethical for physicians to assist in, we used to call it physician-assisted suicide. Now we call it medical aid in dying. Is that ethical? Is euthanasia ethical? Is IVF ethical? Should physicians participate in executions? Questions like this, they're theoretical, conceptual in nature. They're not specific to a particular situation going on at the bedside. It might help just to give a few examples of what is clinical ethics, what kinds of things fall in this category. And I know for all of us on the panel, these are things that we talk about all the time, but our listeners might not have the same ready recognition. But one thing that constantly comes up in my hospital is, what should we do when the care team's assessment of what is best for the patient conflicts with what the patient thinks is best for the patient, or conflicts with what the family thinks is best for the patient? So how are we going to resolve that? What is their care going to look like? Sometimes patients have things called advance directives, which are documents in which they set forth some of their wishes. They express to people in advance, if this happens, I would like this. I would not like a ventilator. I would like a feeding tube, things like that. So what do we do if the patient has a written document like that, maybe a living will, but the patient also has designated someone to speak for him or her in the event that they're not able to do so? And what is in the written document is not the same as what the patient's designate is telling the healthcare team to do. Should they listen to what's in writing, or should they listen to the person that the patient has designated to be their healthcare agent? What if a patient comes in after a terrible accident and they're unconscious, or maybe a fire, God forbid, and there's nobody with them? They come in alone. They can't speak to the care team. The patient has no identification with them. So the care team has no idea who this person is, no idea what this person might want them to do in a given situation. What should their care look like in a situation like that? And maybe I'll just give one last example and stop. We know that it's very important for patients to feel like their information is confidential and private, and that they can share freely with their doctor or their provider. What do we do when maintaining that information might actually cause harm to the patient or cause harm to someone else? So those are the kinds of, there's many, many more, but those are the kinds of situations that we're talking about when we speak about and refer to clinical ethics. I'm sure I've left stuff out. Jason, why don't you?
Well, that was pretty thorough. I mean, I'm glad I let you go first there, because that was a pretty good answer. So, I mean, the only thing I would say alongside that, and the reason why I love being involved with clinical ethics is because, and exactly as you say, Karen, it's often so gray, meaning it's frequently not about here's the clear right and here's the clear wrong, and you must do this and you must not do that. Oftentimes we're looking at like, what's the least bad? How do we balance benefits? We're trying to benefit a patient with all of the burdens associated with the interventions, and like trying to figure out how to be most respectful to individuals and understand what their goals are and their values and their preferences. And it's just like, it's really a balancing act and an art form in a way. And it's just trying to figure out, and every case is different and unique, and all depends on every specific case dependent issue that arises. And it's just like, trying to figure out what's the least bad approach. What's the approach that, is most respectful and most appropriate in accordance with our responsibilities to these vulnerable individuals at this moment. And I just find it to be so invigorating, because it's an opportunity really to do the most we can to help in very complex and challenging scenarios. Neal, how about you?
Thanks, Jason. I think what I would add to Karen's very thorough and helpful definition, as well as yours, is a reminder that clinical ethics, as conceived by the founders of the field, has four sort of broad principles. The autonomy of the patient, that is what they want or would want. Beneficence, we have to do good for the patient. Non-maleficence, we have to not do bad to the patient, do no harm. But there's also an aspect of justice, and justice is always situated within a broader organizational or social or communal context. And I think one of the things we're learning to pay more attention to since the pandemic is that there are clinical ethics concerns that are not solely about the wishes or autonomy of the patient. If the surrogate decision makers for a person with a terminal disease are insisting that everything be done and the patient be kept in the ICU for weeks on end, but that's a very finite resource that would benefit other people with a greater chance of recovery, that's a legitimate thing for an ethics consultant or an ethics committee to explore. If what's going on is causing great moral distress to the caregivers, well, their needs and well-being are also part of the overall ethical equation. And sometimes we may have to say to patients or their families that, yes, we must respect your autonomy, but it occurs within a larger context of resource management, of making sure that resources are distributed fairly, of taking care of the people who are caring for you. And sometimes those are very nuanced and difficult discussions that need to be handled with great skill. We have a competence within the list of competencies for becoming a board-certified professional chaplains, which includes supporting ethical decision-making and being able to name ethical theories. But that doesn't mean you're really competent in ethics. It means that you have some familiarity with it. And as Karen pointed out, organizational ethics are not the same thing as clinical ethics. So I guess what we may want to talk about as people involved in chaplaincy is, how do chaplains leverage their skills and their training towards participating in the ethics process? What do they bring to the table, and what might they need to learn in order to be better at participating in the ethics context? Jason, you want to go first?
Sure. It's a great question. A very important question. I actually teach that seminar in our CPE program at our hospital on, how to answer that question. Because there is, even before I get to that issue, there is another big issue that the phrase ethics committee, it means different things in different contexts, and people often misunderstand it. I see a lot of chaplains when, we try to volunteer to, read people's materials and proofread for them. A lot of people will say what is your competency with clinical ethics? They'll say, well, I'm an ethical person. I try to do good. I try not to hurt people. I try to be nice and polite. It's not necessarily being kind or good. There's also ethics, as was mentioned outside, I chair the NAJC's ethics committee. That is very different than clinical ethics in a hospital. An organizational ethics committee is typically when there's some kind of a concern about an infraction, and there might be concerns about if there's going to be any sort of question about if an individual remaining a member of an organization, and they have to determine if they have done something that violates the policies of an organization. That's also very different than clinical ethics.
I understand the competencies that a chaplain seeking certification needs to demonstrate around ethics is not related to clinical ethics. It's related to ethics in spiritual care. Have they reviewed the spiritual care code of ethics? Do they understand what their ethical obligations are in their interactions with patients and colleagues and like that? So maybe I'm wrong about that, but I have never understood those competencies actually to relate to what we're talking about tonight.
Interesting, because I have, but not in the terms of, let's say, how we would say today, going out of one's lane. Obviously, a chaplain has to be careful to stay in their lane. There's ethics professionals, and a chaplain shouldn't get involved in that. But the way I saw clinical ethics from a chaplain's perspective, meaning what would a chaplain's competency be, is that there is an aspect in terms of supporting clinical decision-making and helping people figure out for themselves, not telling them what to do. Obviously, and that's not what clinical ethicists do either. But are you familiar with the different theories of how people make ethical decisions? Like Neal mentioned, the principlist approach of the 4 principles. And there's, utilitarianism, and there's so many different theories of ethical decision-making. And I actually think that chaplains are very well situated. Not that chaplains necessarily automatically have the training, but a core aspect of chaplaincy training is, first of all, being good listeners, having good listening skills, helping people to articulate what matters for them. So much about chaplaincy is being architects of spiritual space in a hospital, helping a moment become spiritually meaningful. And ethics is very much about being architects of ethical space and ethical reflection, helping people, reflect on what matters now, what are the key issues at stake. And because chaplains have this ability to be good listeners, a major approach, besides for let's say the principlist approach in bioethics today is called the narrative approach, where it's all about helping people to articulate their own narrative and their story and what matters for them in this moment. And I think chaplains can be very good at that. In addition to chaplains, focus especially on cultural sensitivity, especially a chaplain that can appreciate an individual's religious sensitivities and therefore can be a translator or of those values or a support of those individual values. In these ways, chaplains kind of support clinical ethics and decision-making for their patients, even if they're not actually working as an ethics consultant, so to speak.
I'll jump in here and say that I agree with you 100%, Jason. And in my role, both as director of the chaplains department and also as the ethics coordinator, I often use other chaplains as ways to broaden the conversation, right? Maybe there's some kind of breakdown in communication between a family and their caregivers, I'll say to one of my members of my team, can you go and try to find out what's going on? Maybe they'll talk to you. Maybe they'll tell you why they are not interested in talking to palliative care or won't entertain the notion of end-of-life considerations. Maybe they'll see you as someone they can open up with and you can translate their views, their perspectives, their values for the care team. But once I'm involved in a case as the ethics coordinator, I am rarely and probably never involved in a case as the chaplain. But being part of a team, I can kind of coordinate both approaches at once. And that's often very, very helpful. I remember one case where there was an elderly woman near the end of life, and the daughter was insisting on doing everything. And the mom would just say, whatever she wants. And I sent 2 chaplains in, one to talk with the daughter and one to talk with the mom, and found out that they both knew mom was dying, but they weren't willing to admit it to each other. And that's what was so stuck. And by leveraging chaplaincy, we were really able to avoid an ethics process altogether because we got people talking. And Jason, I love your metaphor of the architect of spiritual space and the architect of ethical reflection. I'm going to steal that from you, and I don't promise to always say that in your name, but I will do my best. So Karen, did you have anything you wanted to add to this piece about what chaplains bring to the table?
In our research article, which maybe we'll talk about a little bit later, we initiate the discussion by acknowledging that virtually all healthcare chaplains at some point encounter ethical dilemmas in the provision of daily care, right? And this is in large part because of the role that chaplains play in helping with medical decision making. They are instrumental in some cases, whether that is facilitating communication or translating something that someone is saying that someone else is hearing differently than is intended, that bridge that we serve between the patient and the family on the one hand and the care team on the other hand. So there's really no question that chaplains are routinely engaged in helping to resolve ethical dilemmas at the bedside. And there's actually a pretty rich body of literature documenting that aspect of the chaplain's function. What we were looking at was not that, right? We were looking at an emerging development that some chaplains, not all chaplains, but some chaplains are going beyond their everyday role in spiritual care and taking on formal roles in their organization's institutional clinical ethics program, whether that is sitting on a committee or doing ethics consultation or managing a clinical ethics department or something like that. But we absolutely found as part of our research that there is a skill set that chaplains acquire in the course of CPE and afterwards that does make them quite well suited to the work of clinical ethics. So as Jason said, active listening skills, the ability to present a calm, non-judgmental presence, knowledge about family and group dynamics, being able to elicit a patient's core values and articulate those for the care team and advocate for those core values to be incorporated into the care plan. Chaplains are very aware of their own biases and other people's biases. All these sorts of things that chaplains learn in the process of becoming a chaplain serve them well. What we also discovered is that there are certain things they don't learn in CPE that can present barriers to them depending on what role they're taking informal clinical ethics and why they're taking that role and who asked them to take that role. And no question that there's substantial overlap in the skills that chaplains bring to both.
Thank you. Is there anything else you want to tell us from your research that would be good takeaways for the chaplains and the people who support spiritual care who may be listening to this podcast?
So it was a really interesting project. We had some anecdotal information that over the past several years, healthcare chaplains in the United States were reporting that they were being, as you were, Neal, tapped by their organizations to expand their role beyond spiritual care, to include formal participation in the work of clinical ethics. And until now, there had really been no research on this. And so a few of us decided that we would conduct a national survey to sort of better capture the experience of chaplains who were working in this area. And over 300 chaplains responded. I think there were like 337 or something like that.
I was one of them.
And you were one of them. Great. And so to be eligible to participate, the chaplain needed to, number one, be currently or previously employed as a chaplain in the United States. We were only looking at the United States. And two, engaged in the formal work of clinical ethics in their organization, right? So not the kind of integrated touch points with ethics that we were describing earlier, but actually some sort of formal engagement. And we found that the majority reported involvement with the formal work of clinical ethics in three ways. One was as a member of the ethics committee at their institution. A great many of them reported serving as the chair or the co-chair of their committee. Secondly, as participants in ethics consultation services. A lot of them reported that they did that as part of a larger ethics committee or in smaller consultation groups. Not very many were doing that solo, but that was another category of activity. And third, as leaders of ethics programs. And some interesting things that we found were that while many voluntarily chose to participate in clinical ethics work, like I did, a number did report that they were assigned to clinical ethics roles by their employer on the assumption that that's just part of the chaplain's responsibilities, some sort of a breakdown in understanding actually about clinical ethics and what that discipline is and what might be required. So it was just assumed that the chaplain would take this on. Some indicated that they weren't even aware of those assumptions at the time that they were hired. So in other words, the chaplain was hired, say, to be the manager or the director of spiritual care. And unbeknownst to them, that position included the responsibility to lead the clinical ethics program as well. So those were the primary areas. And like I said, we found that there were a number of things that chaplains brought to those roles that made them uniquely suited for the work. We also found that in many cases, chaplains were lacking the substantive knowledge about the specific discipline of clinical ethics that they needed for at least some of their roles. So maybe they didn't have a basic clinical ethics vocabulary or knowledge, as Jason said, about clinical ethics theories or frameworks or core concepts. Maybe they were short in their understanding of relevant laws or hospital policies that are relevant to clinical ethics. Or a lot of them said that they did not know how to document an ethics consultation in the medical record. They knew how to chart as a chaplain, but they did not know what to do after they had participated in a clinical ethics consult. Interestingly, the study showed that chaplains are pretty much on their own in trying to address these deficiencies in their substantive knowledge. They rely pretty heavily on self-education or on-the-job training or workshops or webinars, maybe even their own institutions' ethics committees. And there was some evidence in the study that chaplains feel like they face roadblocks in convincing their employers to support those educational efforts. It requires time, it requires financial backing. And some chaplains reported feeling distress about this because they were being charged with responsibilities, but they weren't necessarily being given the support that they needed to fulfill them. So one of the questions that we ask at the end of the study, and I'm interested in what you guys think about it, is what should we do about that? What do we do to support chaplains who either wanted to go into this area or are being required to go into this area, but don't necessarily get that substantive knowledge in CPE? A few said that they got a little bit, but not very many said that they felt fully equipped to perform. I'm curious, do you think this is the responsibility of professional chaplaincy associations, certification bodies, knowing that their constituents are going into this field and need this? Or do you think it's the responsibility of the healthcare organizations that are expecting chaplains to be able to do things that they weren't trained to do and didn't know they were going to be doing? Is it the responsibility of the clinical ethics, bioethics, professional associations? Because like spiritual care, they are also in a professionalization process and building a certification process that Neal has gone through. Are they accountable for who is doing this work in their profession and getting the training that they need? So those were some of the things that we looked at, some of our takeaways, and some of the questions that we're still left with.
The answer is yes to all of the above, that the chaplaincy organizations should be providing webinars or courses or specialty certifications in clinical ethics, and I don't think it would be particularly hard to do so. Yes, the ASBH, American Society for Bioethics and Humanities, should be doing a better job of educating hospitals about what clinical ethics is and it isn't. It isn't just tapping on the shoulder of some person you think is nice and saying, hey, run an ethics committee, but it is a profession, or both a profession and a practice. And I think the word used was a discipline. And I think individual chaplains need to take on the responsibility of upping their game. It's not hard to find great textbooks and great webinars. And, just on YouTube alone, you can get a pretty fantastic education in clinical ethics, but you need to know what you don't know. And all of the organizations need to send the message, hey, this is not as simple as you think. And there may be things you don't know, but there's a lot of ways to get there. Jason, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would just say I think there's two layers of responsibility. On the one hand, if someone wants to achieve a real expertise, they're going to have to go and earn that through, masters and doctorates and do formalized courses. What could be provided and what there's, I think, a need for from organizations like NAJC and ASBH and others is if someone wants to educate themselves, which is an important thing that people need to do, in professional capacities. What are the key, textbooks, the key articles, some of the key podcasts? If we could help people understand, here's a little bit of a self-learning curriculum, I think that could be very beneficial to get a basic knowledge, not the expertise that would require, really advanced degrees.
So I can say right there, in addressing that, if you go to the ASBH website and go to the HECSI section, the Healthcare Ethics Consultant Certified website, there is a curriculum of articles and books that are the foundation for the HECSI exam. And that would be a great place for anybody to start. And if anybody listening has questions, reach out to me. I can refer you to that. In the last few minutes we have, I want to explore a little bit of any potential tensions between functioning as an ethicist within secular institutions and our own Jewish ethical commitments. For example, New York just passed medical aid in dying, something which, as a conservative rabbi, I have strong feelings about. Medical aid in dying has been practiced in California for a much longer time. And I could see situations where secular ethics takes us in one direction and Jewish ethics takes us in another. And I'm wondering if either of you have encountered those situations, and if so, how you manage that.
Well, there's certainly quite a bit. There's many areas in which there can be tension. I really see your question in two different ways. One is, is there a difference between secular approaches to various medical ethics types of issues versus classical traditional Jewish approaches, which there certainly are in many cases, and there's also much overlap. Another way I kind of take your question, which is another distinction, is also differences of methodology. So for example, as a chaplain, my role is to, as we've discussed, be a good listener, help people find their own sources of strength. I always remember when I was first learning how to be a chaplain, one patient who I ran into in shul, I overheard him saying to someone, "Oh, that chaplain helped me so much in the hospital." And I remembered that this was a patient who I visited every day, but I just checked in. I just stopped in and just listened to him for a few minutes, just share with me his struggles. And then I left. I didn't help him. I thought to myself, I did nothing to help him. I just listened to him. I just sat there with him. But as a chaplain, that can be very helpful to people. People want someone who's compassionate, who cares about them, who's a good listener, who helps them articulate what they're going through and find their own sources of strength. I don't know that an ethics consultant, someone working in ethics, if they would just check in but not actually provide any feedback and input and guidance, that would be successful as an ethicist, right? Their role is different. It's more directive. It's more to provide specific guidance. It's also oftentimes much more focused on legal principles and guidance, whereas as chaplains, it's oftentimes we're talking to patients about things that are much more theoretical and philosophical and metaphysical. So it can be a really different way of interacting with patients. So I don't even see it necessarily as like a contradiction or a tension even. It's just more of a complement. It's just different ways of interacting, different ways of approaching things. And oftentimes people can really benefit by having an approach from someone from a secular ethics point of view that gives them specific guidance and that can share with them what the legal and the kind of broader philosophical approaches are to specific issues. And then also having their own chaplaincy approach where someone is providing care and compassion and listening and also guidance from within classical Jewish, religious, spiritual tradition that can be meaningful to certain people at certain times.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. First of all, I want to be clear that in my clinical ethics roles, I do not function as a clinical ethicist. I don't perform clinical ethics consultation. That's done by our professionally hired, paid clinical ethicists. So my involvement with formal clinical ethics revolves around participation on ethics committees, and occasionally I also participate with our ethics policy work group, where maybe we get together and we will develop a policy to address an issue that is coming up over and over again at the bedside, or we'll take an annual look at a policy that already exists and maybe we'll revise it or update it or something like that. But so I don't have tension in that sense because I don't function as a clinical ethicist. The other thing I just want to clarify is that the medical aid in dying issue is a bioethics issue. It's not a clinical ethics issue. It may become one for you once it becomes legal and you get into specific cases about whether it is being applied appropriately in a specific case at the bedside. But certainly there is a lot of potential tension between things that happen in the world of Western ethics and Jewish bioethics, right? Western bioethics and Jewish bioethics. But it's not per se a clinical ethics issue. I'm curious about something that I can't answer, but maybe the two of you can. I've wondered whether there is potentially more tension for Jewish chaplains who are also clergy. And what I'm wondering is just what you said, Jason. If you're a rabbi, perhaps you see it as your role at the bedside to teach about Judaism from your particular perspective and to exhort your constituents to make decisions and live their lives in accordance with certain precepts. And I would guess that maybe that could cause some distress when certain secular Western ideas, especially the primacy that the Western philosophy places on personal autonomy, seems to conflict with some of our Jewish ideas. But if you're a chaplain, then you likely see your role more as being to elicit from the patient what values and priorities they hold dear and most highly cherish, and then to ensure that those values and priorities are acknowledged and appropriately incorporated into the care plan. So that it seems like the Jewish chaplain acting as a chaplain wouldn't necessarily experience tension over, say, a patient decision that was not consistent with Jewish interpretation of that issue. What do you think?
Yeah, it's a great question. Great question. I mean, definitely it can be a challenge because as a rabbi, sometimes if a patient asks me a question, I feel like, well, I'm a rabbi. I have to give an answer that I'm comfortable with. However, I'm also a chaplain and a rabbi. And so, usually as a chaplain, I won't just give an answer. I don't just take the bait. Someone says, oh, Rabbi, do you think I'm going to go to hell for doing this or something, some kind of question people sometimes ask? I'm not going to just give an answer. Well, the Gemara, the Talmud says this and that. I will say, well, tell me more about why you're asking that question. Tell me about why is this something that's always been bothering you? Or is this new? In other words, I'm not just answering questions right away, but sometimes even just being there, I have to ask myself, does my presence in what's happening right now imply consent? And am I saying, oh, as the rabbi, and I do have to be careful about it just because there is this concept of what we call, ziyuf haTorah. You can't falsify or lie about what the Torah says. On the other hand, providing compassion and presence is rarely ever wrong. And so I usually feel comfortable that no matter what's happening, I can be there and be compassionate, non-anxious presence for people.
I think it's not so much a matter of being a rabbi or being clergy as to how you conceive of your responsibility towards or your covenantal relationship with aspects of the Jewish tradition. Let me just give almost a kind of trivial answer. I know of an Orthodox rabbi who's an interfaith chaplain who has a boundary for himself that he won't deliver certain kinds of religious goods associated with the Christian faith to patients. He doesn't like handling them. He makes sure that they get delivered. He understands that that's an important part of people's faith journey, but he's got a boundary for himself. I don't know that would be different whether he was a rabbi or not. It's just his personal faith and moral boundary. He's a great chaplain, and I respect his boundaries around that. I think for me, I could imagine situations in the hospital where I might want to recuse myself either as chaplain or rabbi, saying I'm simply not comfortable with this situation. But as Jason said, for the most part, I am able to differentiate my role as a chaplain from my role as a rabbi, and we almost never get to the point where decisions are being made based on something I would say or not say that would come into deep conflict with my values. So thank you for raising that question. It's a great question and one that I do think about. I think we need to wrap this up now. And so what I'd like to ask you both is, to our listeners, what piece of Torah wisdom or Jewish thinking do you bring along with you when you're doing ethics work as a chaplain that helps sustain you and would inspire others?
For me, it's not anything earth-shattering, but I think it is very consistent. The Torah wisdom that I most consistently carry in my work as a chaplain and also in my work in clinical ethics is in the Holiness Code at the beginning of Chapter 19 of Vayikra of Leviticus. You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. And I understand that verse to mean that while we're not God, we are enjoined to be God-like in our behaviors and our actions. And we learn in Talmud Sota that as God clothes the naked, so do you. Clothe the naked, the Holy One visited the sick, so do you visit the sick. The Holy One comforted mourners, buried the dead, and so on, and so do you. And the verse reminds me that each of us, all of us, are made B'Tselem Elohim in the image of God, and each of us has the capacity to bring holiness into the world by doing our best to emulate God's attributes of holiness. And so this is the wisdom that encourages me every day to strive to offer those sacred qualities of presence and compassion and empathy in my efforts to alleviate suffering and accompany patients and families and our staff members on their journey toward healing and wholeness.
That's so beautiful. It's also something that I turn to for guidance and sustenance. I think in the context of our conversation about ethics, one teaching that I just constantly return to is, in the Torah, right in the beginning, right in Bereshit, in the beginning when it talks about, even from the Eitz Chaim, when the Torah says that God said to Adam and Eve, Heina Adam haya ke'echad mimenu l'das tov v'ra. They are now like us, like me, God says, of knowing good and evil. And there's a Rashi there. The Rashi's commentary on that verse says this is actually what distinguishes humanity as a species, is l'dat tov v'ra, is distinguishing between right and wrong. This sense of moral agency, of moral intelligence, what it means to be human, is to take responsibility, to do the right thing. And as we've discussed, it's not always so easy, so black and white, so clear, but to try our best to find what's just, what's right, what's compassionate, what's the right thing to do in each situation, and to be motivated by always recognizing that to be human means that we have to try our best to strive to figure out what's right and to do the best we can in life and make these moral decisions. How about you, Neal?
The two of you are operating on a very inspirational level of Torah wisdom. And I think for me, I have a more kind of practical methodology that I take from my Jewish background, which is that if you've studied Jewish texts, you know that the tradition generally does not rely on simple answers to simple questions, but elicits and honors and explores complexity. And I'll tell a little story here. I remember once when I was managing the discussion at the ethics committee, and it was something like, okay, you agree with the first part of what he said, but you agree with the second part of what she said. And these are the things we agree on, and these are the things we disagree on. And what we really need to resolve is this question and that question. And everybody looked at me and was like, well, how do you do that? Well, I studied Talmud for several years, and I became sensitive to hearing the question behind the question and learning to ask questions about why people are saying what they're saying and digging a little deeper to see what we agree on and what we don't agree on. So I think that's a very Jewish mindset that's helpful in discussing ethics situations. They're almost never straightforward as they might first appear, and you can always ask deeper questions to try to elicit the nuance and then complexity. And I think Judaism taught me to be comfortable with that and to honor that and to sit in the tension sometimes and to listen to the minority voice because they have something really valuable to add that shouldn't be lost. And that's something I try to carry with me when doing ethics work because, as you said so beautifully, Jason, there are rarely simple answers. If there were simple answers, they wouldn't be calling me. But there are shades of gray that we need to dig into in order to honor the situation and the patients and caregivers who are really trying to do the best according to their own ideals. So thank you all for participating in this conversation. I think I'm turning it back to Ed now.
Neshamacast is a production of Neshama, Association of Jewish Chaplains. Thank you to Rabbi Neal Loevinger, Rabbi Jason Weiner, and Chaplain Karen Lieberman for their engaging discussion. Check our show notes for more information about them. Thank you to Steve Lubetkin and Lubetkin Media Companies for producing this episode. Additional thanks for logistical support to Allison Atterbury, NAJC Executive Director, and the NAJC Social Media Committee. Please consider making a contribution to NAJC to support Neshamacast and all of the vital work that NAJC does to promote Jewish spiritual care. We're grateful to the anonymous sponsors of this episode and welcome generous gifts to sponsor future episodes. We also welcome sponsorship from institutions where NAJC chaplains work. Please write to me at neshamacast@gmail.com to discuss a gift or sponsorship opportunity, or click on the link in the show notes to donate. A transcript for this episode is available automatically in the Apple Podcasts app. Our theme music is a nigun for Ki Anu Amecha, written and performed by Reb Cantor Lisa Levine. Please help others find the show by rating and reviewing the show on Apple Podcasts. We welcome comments and suggestions for future programming at neshamacast@gmail.com. And be sure to follow NAJC on Facebook, to learn more about Jewish spiritual care happening in our communities. May we all work together to heal our world.